Uh, this is a story that about our family that I've written for Michael, John, Gary, Beth, Jeremy, David, and Kate. I know that you are all very anxious to know where your ancestors came from. And I'm going to begin with my mother's side of the family. They were Davidsons, and they came from Scotland, where they were a fierce fighting clan. And then that was my grandfather, James Davidson, and he was married to a lady from Ireland, and her name was Sarah Jane Murphy. So I believe she was from Ireland, and probably her family had come over here because of the potato famine. And when she came to this country, she met my great-grandfather, James Davidson, your great-great-great-grandfather, the gentleman in this picture. Oh, wait just a minute, Sissy, now I'll get the picture. Click. Oh, you can zoom in on him. All right, this is James Davidson. And I want to tell you how he got here. You hear about the settlers who moved across the country in covered wagons. Well, that's what he did. His family had come over from Scotland and settled in Ohio. And when he was a young man, he decided to go to Nebraska and homestead. Going across the country in a covered van, fighting Indians, he finally arrived in Nebraska, in Sarpy County, about in the early 1800s, and he married Sarah Jane Murphy, the girl from Ireland. They had one son, Willard Davidson. Now, I want to show you Willard Davidson. Here's Willard Davidson. And he's my mother's father. In this picture, I know you all have seen it in my house. This is Willard Davidson right here. And he is the son of James Davidson and Sarah Jane Murphy Davidson. Sarah was who Sissy Lansing is named after. All right, all of these, this is my grandmother and my grandfather and his parents, and then these are their children, and this is my mother, the little baby, sitting on her mother's lap. Now, David, come and hang this up for me, honey. Would you hang this back there, David? He married Olive Leffler, who had been born in Indiana, one of 13 children. My mother was the fourth child, the only girl. And she had a younger brother who died when he was 12 with a brain hemorrhage. And here's his picture. He's hanging on the wall in my house. My mother was the last of her generation, and she died in 1970, right before Sissy got married. My cousins I have all these cousins who are in that picture. Remember I went to a cousin's reunion in Las Vegas? Well, they're all the children of my mother's brothers, James, John, Floyd, and, well, those three, James, John, and Floyd. And their names are John and Willard, Liz and Bill, Bob and Jean. They're all first cousins. And the only ones I have, since my father's only sibling, Marie, never married. My great-grandfather, upon arriving in Nebraska, built a sod hut, and there he lived until he acquired enough money and property to build a house. He prospered, and my grandfather, his son, had land and owned the bank in Springfield. So my mother grew up with clothes made by a dressmaker, trips to Europe, and one of the first cars in Springfield. Here's a picture of my grandfather in front of his bank And I think that probably was in the early 1900s. I'm not sure what date. They lived in an old farmhouse, and I think I have a picture of the farmhouse. Right here. Oh. My mother had a brother, her brother John lived in Chicago, was an attorney, and Mother went to visit him. And she met a man named Cash Fairman. His parents were missionaries to China, and he had lived there most of his life. He and my mother became engaged, and their wedding plans were all set. He and his friends and family took the train from Chicago to Nebraska, and somewhere along the way he fell off and was killed. It was a terrible tragedy for my mother, who had trunks full of beautiful linens monogrammed and a gorgeous trousseau. To recover from this shattering blow, she joined a Red Cross unit in World War I. I think it was probably about 1916. She was in her 20s, and she went to England and made donuts for the servicemen. Now here's a picture of her in her Red Cross uniform. This is with the Red Cross, and she was in a canteen service, and their whole job was to make donuts. She has a nice little article. Some of you may want to read sometime all about how many donuts they made every day. It has all of her memoirs about that, and she gave this talk to several women's clubs when we used to live in Chicago. Seeing so much tragedy in World War I, the war to end all wars, she eventually returned to the States, where she met my father. He was the friend of one of her Red Cross friends, Margaret Stevens, who also lived in Chicago. In 1920, my mother went to visit Margaret in Chicago, and she met my father. That was probably about 1918. And in 1920, they married in Springfield, Nebraska, and went to Chicago to live, where my father was with an advertising agency. My mother was 34 when I was born, and my brother was born 2 years later. Here's a picture of my mother and David and I. David and I. No, David and me. Picture of David and me. Now, I was born in 1922, and we lived in a suburb of Chicago, River Forest, at 622 Forest Avenue. We had a nice 2-story house and a big tree and a swing in the backyard. The Cahills lived next door, and Janet Armour lived down the street. David was born Armistice Day in 1924. Now the Depression was warming up, and we were soon to move to Nashville. I was in the 5th grade, but now I need to tell you about my father's side of the family. Well, I think that I'll just stick with my mother's side of the family for the time being. The next 7 years in Nashville were spent growing up. Nashville was a great place to live. Lots of parties, dances, a very social town. More than anything else, there was a nightclub called Hetty Ray's out on about a few miles out of the city limits on top of a hill. Hetty Ray's was where everybody went on their dates. We danced to the big bands on the jukeboxes. and that is where you met all the other kids in town. A date cost the boys about 50 cents. With that, he could buy enough gasoline to get to the hill for a few cents and put some coins in the jukebox, and you and he could both have several Cokes. Fraternities back in those days had big name bands to play for their spring balls. The girls wore long dresses, white gloves. The boys sent corsages, and there was always a lot going on at Christmas, and one party after another in the spring. David, my little brother, was usually at the top of the hill up at Hetty Race with his friends, but we more or less ignored each other with true brotherly love. That is the end of the first episode. Now about my father's side of the family. I don't know whether any of you know what my maiden name was, but unfortunately, it was a good name up until that guy started trying to kill Reagan. I have to tell you that I was at St. Mary's School working in the media library, and I was in the only room where we had a television, and half of the school had come to that room as soon as we heard Reagan had been shot. They were congregated in that room. Everybody was they were a standing room only, and the news came on that the president had been shot by John Hinckley. And it was spelled HinckleY, just like my name. Well, I nearly had a heart attack right there. But then I suddenly realized that I didn't know any John Hinckleys in my immediate family. In fact, there's no one in my immediate family except my brother David Hinckley and his two boys, Pete and Danny. And both Pete and Danny are living in the U.S. right now, and they grew up in Puerto Rico, where my brother still lives. So, okay, back to my dad's family. He was born in 1878 in a little town in New Hampshire called West Lebanon, and West Lebanon is right across the river from White River Junction, which was a big railroad center up in the northeast. His mother was from Vermont, and her name was Franca Dana. And somewhere along the line, somebody has the name Dana. I believe it's Kenneth Dana of Lansing. And that's where that name came from. That was my paternal grandmother's maiden name. She moved to West Lebanon and married my grandfather, who was Frederick Dana. I'm not sure his name. He was named one day. Frederick Hinckley. And this is a picture of her. This is my paternal grandmother. Anyway, they lived in a big old rambling white frame house in West Lebanon, where the winters were like 50 below zero for most of the winter. And the house was white frame, and it was narrow on the front with all kind of gingerbread all around the porch. Then you went through the house, and they kept on adding more things. So when you started going through the house, you kept going and going and going, and at the end of it was the barn. And so you could go all the way through the different additions of the house until you got to the barn. And that's where they kept their animals in the winter, because they had to be able to feed them and give them water. Anyway, my father had a younger sister named Marie, and I'm sure all of you children have probably heard of my Aunt Marie. She just died about 8 or 9 years ago in a nursing home up in let's see, how old was she? Was close to 100. Anyway, Aunt Marie was a victim of not having enough vitamin C back during those. Aunt Marie had rickets badly. Her legs were bent because the bones were, they just didn't have enough vitamin C. They didn't know about vitamins back in those days. That's why children have a lot of ascorbic acid now, because it keeps you from having. But she lived a good, healthy life. She lived in Florida most of her adult life. She and my grandmother used to go to Florida every summer. And they had a man named Joe who lived in town in West Lebanon. He was he helped them do things around the house. He was kind of their caretaker. And Joe would pack them all up, take them to catch the train. They had these huge steamer trunks that they took everything with. Those trunks weighed about 2 tons. And he'd load them on the train, and they'd take off for Florida every summer until finally they used to go down in the old Buick. And when my aunt finally bought a car. And then in later times, of course, they flew. But my grandmother died when she was in West Lebanon. And she died in about 1943. And my dad went up there to the funeral. Maybe it was 1942. It was in the 40s. All the family cemetery is up there. My grandmother, my father's name is on the tombstone. My aunt. If any of you are ever up in West Lebanon, you really ought to go by the family cemetery, and you'll see all kinds of Hinckleys up there. I don't know who all of them are. The genealogy is in the file cabinet. Somewhere along the way we ought to have a genealogical buff who'll go into all that. Alright, so now I'm telling you about my dad. When he was, I guess he was 19, he went off to Dartmouth College, which was in Hanover, it was 10 miles away. And he graduated from there in 1903. Then he went off to, wanted to go on a little European trip. He wrote his diary about it, and I have made copies of that, and the original is in my file cabinet. It's really interesting, and he sketched pictures of things that he liked. He went in the steerage. He was with the cows, and he said it didn't smell too good, but it was a good trip over there. He was supposed to be helping take care of the animals. That was how he paid his way over. Then when he landed in England, and he went all through left England, went to the continent, went to all the countries. I think he liked Holland the best. And he drew pictures of windmills and he drew pictures of the way the French ladies looked carrying their huge loaves of bread that they went to the market to buy every day. Well, then he came home and got a job. He was in the advertising business. And that's how he happened to go to Chicago to meet that's where he met my mother. But in the meantime, they all went to Boston real often. Boston is very close to, that's where you fly. I flew up there, about, before Aunt Marie died. I flew to Boston and rented a car with a hand control. And I drove on up to New Hampshire by myself and to see about settling. The lawyer wanted to sell the house and get rid of the furniture, and he wanted me to come up there. And I went to see Aunt Marie in the nursing home then. Then, let's see, pause for a minute. All right, here's a picture of David and I when I think I was about 10. David must have been about 8. And here's my picture of my daddy. And the reason my mother isn't here is because she and her friend, one of our best friends in Nashville was Emma C. Rasco. She was Emma Cannon Davis, the niece of Sam Davis, one of the heroes of the Confederate War. And Sissy, if you'll come in here, I'll show you a picture of Emma C. Emma C. and my mother exchanged pictures, and my mother gave her this miniature, and Emma C. gave her this picture of her on that's here in the dining room.
Right. Where?
The top, right.
That's Emma C.
Mm-hmm.
And who was she?
Emma C. was lived next door to us when we moved to Nashville in 1932, and she was a wonderful neighbor, and taught me a lot of things that I'll never forget. She was just a really fine person. The gentleman over there on the left is Phineas Cook. It says, in case you can't read it, it says, very truly, yours truly, Phineas Cook. Well, I didn't know who he was until I was reading some of Aunt Marie's notes, and she said, it said somewhere that he was the first minister of their church. The Congregational Church was much a part of their lives because they helped build it, and it was only 4 or 5 doors down the street from them in West Lebanon. And my grandmother played the organ, and my Aunt Marie sang in the choir, and they were all much attached to the church. My grandmother played the piano at home at night during the long winter nights, and my dad played the violin. I don't know if he ever played the violin at that church, but they were all very musical. Now this couple right here, they're Hinckley relatives, and I believe that's Daniel Hinckley, and Mary Huntington Hinckley was his wife. And Mary Huntington wrote her memoirs when she lived with her son, my grandfather, George Frederick Hinckley, and she lived with them until she died in 1900. And my Aunt Marie was very much attached to her, and it was her father, her husband. Well, stop for a minute. Mary Huntington Hinckley's husband was the one who had built the house that they lived with in West Lebanon. Now I want to tell you about, I remember one of my first recollections was going to kindergarten, and it seemed like all the other little girls had long hair with fat curls, and I had short hair, which it looks stylish now, but at the time, that's about the only thing I can remember. I don't even remember when all of a sudden I had a little brother, and he was born in 1924. David and I had a good time growing up. We were, nobody was ever lonesome. Whenever there was a snowstorm, we were out there living in our igloo, and we slept under big feather puffs. And we both went to Lincoln High School, which was about 2 or 3 blocks away. It was in River Forest, which had one of the best school systems in the country. Anybody that knows anything about public schools will know that Oak Park, Illinois, and River Forest, suburbs of Chicago, both had excellent schools. I was in the 5th grade then when we moved to Nashville. and the schools there were not nearly as good. But we went to Calvert, which was a public school for finishing out the year when David was in the third and I was in the fifth. And it was hot as Hades, and the inkwells, everybody would kill the flies and just put them in their inkwells. Well, my inkwell was full all the time. I'd go home and tell all these gruesome stories to my parents about how many flies there were. Well, none of us knew that you were supposed to go to a private school in the South, but the next year we started out at Peabody Demonstration School, David and I both, and he was in the fourth and I was in the sixth. Well, Peabody is still there, the college, the demonstration school. I doubt if it's there anymore. They turned it into something else, but we lived right next door to Peabody campus, and so we could go over there and play tennis on the big backboard. They had a huge high board where you could practice tennis. I used to go over there and play and practice. That's how I learned to play tennis. And I was on the tennis team at Peabody, and also when I went to Southwestern. And I even played once in the state tennis tournament. I happened to be in Nashville. I lived in Memphis, but I'd gone to Nashville to visit. So I played in the tournament and beat the first round, but it was fun. And I wish that I kept on doing that, because playing tennis is one of the greatest sports in the world, because you can do it all your life, and you meet the most interesting people in playing any kind of sports like that, golf or tennis. But tennis was my favorite. Oh, and speaking of sports, we even went skiing several times in Nashville. There were, we'd have a big snow, and there were enough hills that we could, my dad would take us, and he took his old pair of skis, which I was supposed to try to put on. They didn't have any way to keep them going straight, so they were going like this all the time. I think they were probably vintage 1880. And I don't know if they're still around here somewhere or not. But we also had ice skates, and we ice skated in Nashville on Centennial Lake many times. And also when we moved to Memphis, we ice skated. So we moved to Memphis. I had just finished West High. After West High opened in Nashville, well, Dave and I both transferred over there. It was a brand new high school, and practically everybody at Peabody moved over to West High. I was in the first graduating class. We started out in the 9th grade, and then that was their highest grade, and we moved on up. So in 1939 I graduated, and David graduated in 1941. No, he didn't graduate from West High, because right after I graduated we moved to Nashville. And when we got to Nashville, I started at, it was Southwestern then, it's called Rhodes College now. And it was a wonderful school and a wonderful 4 years. And David went on to Central. Interesting fact, he had a hard time in math, but when he settled down and finally decided that the teacher wasn't the meanest person in the whole world, David ended up being, that's his great forte, he's a mathematical genius, and has done all kinds of things in engineering because of that. As a matter of fact, he built a reflector. It was built in Puerto Rico the first time he went down there, right after World War II. It was, I think, a mile in diameter. Well, you'll have to find out about that from David because he built this for Tulane. Not just cut it off. The reflector was the largest one in the world at that time. This is right after World War II. And David had figured out some way to how to build that thing. It had to be exactly correct, and it was a concave, and it couldn't be off in any spot more than 1/100th of an inch, because it would have ruined the whole thing. But anyway, that was built by Cornell University, but it was funded by them, and it was or could communicate with the ionosphere through that. It was in Arecibo, Puerto Rico. Anyway, by that time, end of World War II, David was in the Marines, and I had married Don during the war. We got married in I graduated from Southwestern in 1943, and I worked at the Light Gas and Water Division, where I was one of the first women's livers. I remember very well when I found out that the man whose job I had taken had made $200 a month, and I was only making $100 doing the same job. I went storming up to the personnel office and told them that was utterly ridiculous, that I didn't know why I wasn't being paid the same amount. And George Sneed, who was the head of personnel, said, "Well, my dear, we just don't pay women as much as we pay men." And I said, "Well, you don't reduce the cost on their bill. If I get a bill from the LGW, it's the same amount as if I were a man. I really don't think that's fair." But anyway, that was my first brush with the fact that the world really is not fair all the time. So nobody ever said it was fair, and it isn't fair. And during my lifetime, I've seen many inequities become much better. So I think it's a good world, and it doesn't matter that it's not going to. There's always going to be something that isn't fair, and there's always going to be somebody around who's going to fight for it to be fair, as well as those who'll sit around and think, well, that's just your tough luck if it isn't fair for you. Well, anyway, Don went off to the Pacific, and we went out to California. We got married in we were married in June of 44 at the Evergreen Presbyterian Church, and then we went to maybe a month, within 3 weeks, we went off to Kingsville, Texas, and that's down near Corpus, and we drove down there. Well, this was the day after we got married, I believe. We started driving. We had reservations in Houston at the Rice Hotel. Well, when we got to Nacogdoches, we were driving up. Don had a Pontiac.
Corpus.
So we're heading for Corpus Christi. And when we got to, we'd driven from Memphis through Little Rock, and it got into Nacogdoches, which is where David's wife, Margie, his first wife, Margie, was from Nacogdoches. So I always knew where Margie was from. That place was vividly imprinted in my head, because we were, Don was expounding on some historical point. He was a pretty good history buff, and was talking loudly, and had his mind on that, and went off the side of the road. Well, to make a long story short, we wrecked a wheel and a tire, so we had to get towed into Nacogdoches, which, and we were delayed in getting to Houston. So by the time we got to Houston, it was probably 11 or 12 o'clock at night, and there were no hotels anywhere. We stopped at every motel on the way, and of course, when we got to where we had reservations at the Rice, they had told us that they didn't think we were coming, and they had given our reservations away. So the rest of the night, now this is how I learned to drive at night, because Don, he went to sleep, and I drove the rest of the way on down to Victoria, Texas. Driving the whole night. When we got to Victoria, Texas, it was daylight, and so we pulled over near a church, and I think I slept there for about a half an hour, and then Don woke up. So we drove on to El Paso, and when we got to El Paso, I don't mean El Paso, I mean Corpus Christi. We looked for a place to stay, and we finally found we stayed at a boarding house for 1 or 2 nights, and we had orders to go to Kingsville. But he did check in at Corpus Christi at the naval base. He was a navigator and had trained down in Hollywood, Florida. So then we went on to Kingsville, and we lived down there 3 months, and it was really fun. There was a tennis court. We got to play tennis a few times, and we lived in with the sheriff and his wife. They had 2 rooms that they rented, and so we had a room, and the person that had the other room was a real pretty blonde girl named Gloria, and I was in her wedding because there was a picture somewhere around here. We became good friends. And also the people next door to us, well, her name was Ma Duncan. And Ma Duncan was, she sold, let's see, Mrs., the people where we lived, the sheriff's wife, she sold Avon. And Ma Duncan was full of brush lady. And she had all kinds of good stuff with the Full of Brush Company. And she went on a vacation one week and asked me if I wanted to be the Full of Brush lady. So I never tried to sell anything before in my life, but I thought I'd try. Well, they had roaches that were this big down all over Texas. So all I would do was I just walked up to a house and I'd say, "Would you like to try some of our Full of Brush roach poison?" That was the way I got my foot in the door. Everybody that was at home bought some roach poison from me because Full of Brush it was really good. Well, Ma Duncan, Don and I would go there and eat dinner with Ma Duncan occasionally. And she had a daughter named Lois Jean. And Lois Jean, one time, we were always eating over there. And Lois Jean was a few years younger than I. She went out when she married, she went to California. Now this is many years later. And she lived next door to somebody whom I didn't know at all then. But it turned out it was Glenn and Dorothy Medic. So Lois Jean told Glenn and Dorothy when Glenn got orders to Memphis, she said, "Oh my goodness, I have a very good friend who lives in Memphis. And you just must meet her. I'll give you her name." So she gave them my name. Well, it was a coincidence because the Medics had already, before they got around to looking me up, they had through a real estate agent, they were looking at Pat and Bill Reed's house, which was right down the road. Well, I remember very well I was up at the mailbox, and along came this station wagon down the road. We lived at 477 James Road then. We lived in the big old house on the James Road where all of my children grew up. So there were, the road was a nice little country winding narrow road, a beautiful little road. Barry Brooks' place was across the street with all the cows. He had a couple of 100 acres and black Angus, and there weren't that many cars coming down the road, and here came this station wagon with a California license plate and a horse trailer on the behind. Well, little did I know they were going down to check the house they were going to buy, which was Pat and Bill Reed's house with the swimming pool. So that was then shortly thereafter, well, they called us and we found out that they were friends of Lois Jean's. All right, well, back to the war. Don got his orders and went to, he was going out to the Pacific. So I went with him to San Francisco. And we, when we were out there, well, he ran into, he had been married before, and he ran into his first wife. And so we asked her to go out to dinner. So we all went out to dinner in San Francisco. Well, I was having morning sickness. So we ate at every wonderful place in the world. I could hardly eat anything. Donna was born about 6 months later. So that was why the only thing I ever wanted to eat then were pickles and bananas. I was just desperate for bananas. Oh, did they ever have beautiful fruit in California. But with all those good places that we ate, like Top of the Mark, and I don't remember the names of all the wonderful eating places, but San Francisco is known, and known for their good eating places, and I was never hungry while I was there. Anyway, I rode the train back home and carried my suitcase all the way. It was a lucky thing Donna got born with nothing wrong with her. I remember there weren't any bellhops, or what did we call them then. But at least I could get on a train. You couldn't get on a plane because the services had all the planes that existed. But civilians just rode on trains then. I rode the train all the way back. I think I got home, I had about 30 cents left in my pocket. I don't know how I had gotten, but it was such a long train ride, I just hadn't allowed enough money. Back then you didn't have any plastic money. Anyway, I made it home, and I lived with my mother and father on Benton Avenue for the next year. And then Donna was born, and she played around up on we had a balcony. We lived on the second floor of the house at 1391 Benton. Those were really fun days because all of my friends were in the same boat. They had all gone off with their husbands and spent whatever time they could together, and then the husbands were all sent overseas. So all the wives, we played mahjong every day, or we played bridge. We played a little bridge, but mostly during the war we were playing mahjong. But this, of course, was after Donna was born. Up until the day Donna was born, I worked for the Red Cross. I was in the family service, and all of the servicemen who came in through Memphis, if they lost they were always losing their billfolds, whether that was true or not. We always gave them money. And we told them where to go if they didn't have any place to stay. We helped them get extra time if their wife was sick or having a baby, or if there was a funeral. That was what my job was in the Red Cross. I had to verify the illness. You call the doctor and verify the illness, and then you call the headquarters and got them an extension. You sent telegrams back in those days. You didn't use a lot of, but you sent just telegrams by the thousands to verify illnesses and to contact the field director, American Red Cross field director, either at the APO or wherever the man was stationed. So I did that, and right up till supposedly 2 weeks before Donna was born. Well, my mother and dad went off to Quantico because David was graduating from the Marine Corps. He was getting his commission at Quantico. So they went off to stay with him, and I had taken retired from my job, and they had a big party for me, and I'd gotten a few little clothes and things for the baby. I was getting ready to spend the next 2 weeks buying her layette. Darned if she didn't get born the next day. My last day of work was Friday, and Saturday Donna was born. So Mother and Daddy hustled on back. They got back, but Demetra, my friend Demetra, had spent the night with me, so we rushed off to the hospital, and Demetra got so upset over the whole event that I had to drive to get myself to the hospital, which wasn't but 2 blocks away. It was the Methodist, where the Navy doctor delivered Donna. So then the war was over. I believe Donna was about 3 or 4 months old when the war was over, and Martha Canale and were driving. We had Donna. Danny Canale hadn't been born yet. Donna was sitting in Martha's lap. We were driving downtown, and everybody in Memphis was down there. It was a big hoopla, and there were firecrackers getting thrown around. And thank the Lord, Martha closed the window, because the firecracker hit the window. It fallen right in Donna's face. So everybody was excited, and the traffic was bumper to bumper moving down Main Street. There were just 1 million cars, and everybody was honking their horns. It was the most exciting day of my life. This was shortly after the bomb was dropped. So anyway, then Don and I decided to, he wanted to have a little land, so that was when we started wheeling and dealing, driving around the country, trying to find a place to live. It wasn't just right next to somebody else, and he wanted a little land, and we finally found the old farmhouse at 3744 James Road, which was owned by Alex White. And that was a coincidence, because he was the uncle of a friend of mine named Mopsy White, who was in my wedding. And she had come out to Raleigh as a young child when she was a little bitty to see her uncle. So anyway, we bought the house and 65 acres for $10,000. But back in those days, that was a lot of money. We didn't have a whole lot, but I'd saved $2,000 for my. Well, I worked while before Donna was born, and I'd saved all the checks that I'd gotten my Navy. Checks. So I had saved all those, and we did have enough for a down payment. So that's how we bought the house on the James Road. And we didn't move in it. We worked on it for a year while we lived with my parents. And then Don got in the building business, and that's how we ended up living in the subdivision. We didn't subdivide until they finally got water, and because the road went in, when the road went in, that meant that we were going to get, we ran some roads through here and subdivided. And Don did a lot of subdividing. He built a lot of the houses around here. All right, back to my ancestors. I forgot to tell you that my father was Hinckley's. The first one to come to this country was Samuel Hinckley, and he was from Kent, England, and he came over to this country in 1620 on a ship named the Hercules. And when I went to England, I wanted to go there and see what I could find, but we didn't have time. We did as much as we could. My trip to Europe was fun. Donna and Betty Kaiser and Margaret Harris and I went. We rented a car and we drove from England. We stayed in England a couple of days. In London, and then we drove up to Scotland, and then came back on the other side. Well, we didn't go through Kent. I believe Kent is on the southeast coast. And I hope some of you all will go there and try to find where the Hinckleys came from. But that was the first Hinckley that came to this country. And there were many Hinkleys, like the last governor of the Plymouth colony was a Hinckley. There were many of them who distinguished themselves. The Adams line came from, they were closely connected. I have that all in the family history. Some of you might, if any of you want to look that up, well, we already have it. Okay, Sissy cut for a minute. I just turned off the potatoes, and I'm about ready to turn off myself. Think that I've covered enough territory for one sitting, and I might do some more next year. Like I would like to tell you all about all these old pieces of furniture, like this old settee that came from Aunt Marie's house, and this old couch that came from Aunt Marie, this little table, that funny chair. Now that brass bucket came from my mother's side of the family. And this old chest of drawers Don bought here in Memphis, and he refinished that. This is one of Aunt Marie's relics, and that little chair. I'll do some more about the things in this house. The warming pan behind Sissy that looks like a popcorn popper, that was from my father's side of the family. And those are Williamsburg pictures up over the mantel that I painted those back about 15 years ago. The little plate, those are bridge tallies behind the camera. Those are bridge tallies that Mother had, and I thought they were pretty because they were hand-painted Japanese ladies with shells on them. And I hope somebody will treasure them and admire them as much as I have. Anyway, I now want to wish you all a very very, very Merry Christmas. And the next thing you will see on this tape are about 5 minutes of movies that my father took when we lived in Chicago. So the first part of them, I think David must have been about 3 and I was about 5. And my mother was in the scene where we rush out to the cab. That was when we used to go to the dentist. We had to go downtown to the dentist, so we took the cab from our house to the elevated train, and then we rode down on the elevated down to downtown Chicago. And then we always got to go to Marshall Field's and get our hair cut. We loved to go to Marshall Field because they had all those funny little pings that, when they rang, they were bing, bing, bing. They have a lot of noises now that do like that, but those were the first that I ever remember. And all the department stores had them. And everything, their communication within the store was all bing, bing, bing. So, anyway, have a Merry Christmas and enjoy watching the little 5-minute film. It's David and I and our grandmother Hinckley is the first old lady, and then the second elderly lady is my grandmother Hinckley, who is my grandmother Davidson, who visited us real often because she lived much closer than my grandmother Hinckley. So again, that's my father playing golf, and then I think he took a picture of one of his friends. Probably he was going to show his friend what was wrong with his stroke. So I hope you enjoyed the little movie. Thank you and goodbye.